Yogena chittasya padena vancham malam sharirasya cha vaidyagena yopakrutam pravaram muninam patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi stuve patanjalim vyasam shankaram cha munitrayam katra sutrasya bhashyasya kramad vivaranasya cha. You will remember that during the last few sessions we were discussing some of the definitions given in the early sutras of Samadhipada, which constitute some kind of an introduction to the entire psychology and philosophy of yoga. Yoga is defined in the second sutra, the yoga ka chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is nothing but transcending the vrittis, cessation of the vrittis. And then in the succeeding sutras, we discussed how Patanjali defines chittam, that's our mental world, the whole mechanism of our mind, memories, our sense of ego, sense of remembrance, all together can be called chittam, the mechanism of human mind. And it's defined. And then vrittis are defined. Vrittis are fivefold. And then in the last sutra that we discussed in the last session, Abhyasa Vairagya Abhyam Tad Nirodha, how to attain the cessation of vrittis. So these sutras constitute some kind of an informal introduction, though they are found in the Samadhipada, but still in terms of our spiritual practice, Samadhi is the third stage. Sadhana is the first stage. Vibhuti is the second stage. Samadhi is the third stage. And Kaivalyam or liberation, emancipation is the fourth and the last stage. Now in the printed books, as I mentioned many times earlier, these chapters are arranged differently. First, we have this Samadhipada, then we have Sadhanapada, then we have Vibhudipada, and then Kaivalyapada. But the way I'm going to discuss, I'm going to change the order. So after finishing the introductory portions contained in Samadhipada, we are now beginning with Sadhanapada. Sadhana means practice. You know what? That's the first stage. We practice something, we practice some spiritual disciplines, and then we get the results, which could be Bhudipada, and the highest result before spiritual liberation, Kaivalya, moksha, liberation, is concentration of Samadhi. That comes the third, and last, of course, Kaivalya, I mean liberation. So this is how we are going to discuss this Patanjali system. So now we will begin with the first sutra of Sadhanapada. So now those of you who have got a text, you can refer to that. The first sutra is Tapaswadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhananani Kriya Yoga. So Kriya Yoga is a technical term used here. Remember, Kriya Yoga, according to Patanjali, is different from many of the popular names that you hear these days. Patanjali's Kriya Yoga consists of self-control, self-restraint, self-study, and self-surrender. This is the primary transition. Now we'll discuss what is tapa. Well, in Indian philosophy in general, tapa is called ascetic practices. In English, we may call ascetic practices. So, for example, on certain occasions, auspicious occasions, we will observe certain vows, fasting, long prayers. It also involves some kind of self-restraint. But Vyasa, with a deep spiritual insight, he is very quick to emphasize one point, and he says these ascetic practices should not be done in such a way that the serenity of the mind is disturbed. So it should be practiced in such a manner that our mind remains serene, undisturbed, calm and quiet. So over asceticism is taboo in yoga. That is a very important point, remember. Self-torture. Any kind of extreme ascetic practices, fasting for many days, or practicing certain disciplines which in some ways torments our mind and body. Vyasa say that is not correct. That is not the right way. So in Vyasa's own words, Tacha, this tapa, chitta prasadanam abadhamanam asevyam tapa. That means chitta prasadanam abadhamanam. It should not disturb or affect or in any way reduce our inner tranquility and peace. So if you fast, your fasting should be undertaken in such a way that it only serves one purpose. You are able to restrain maybe gluttony, so to speak, people who suffer from extreme love for food to the point of that it becomes a stumbling block in spiritual life. Then it is very good. It is a good practice to do some fasting. And also when our physical energy exceeds our mental energy, then also physical ascetic practices like fasting or you can find this in all religious traditions. Going around the sacred place, these practices you find in both Christianity and also in Hinduism. Going around a place of pilgrimage. There are places in Europe where, right from the medieval times, in the Catholic mystical tradition, they used to practice different kinds of asceticism. And that was, of course, very common in India. And also, it is very much common in Buddhism and in many other religious traditions of the East, you find. But it is very much emphasized by Vyasa, the commentator, that the only purpose of asceticism is to keep our physical energy and mental energy in balance. If our physical energy exceeds the ability of the mind to control it, then what happens, it leads to restlessness, physical restlessness. It's a very important point. If the physical energy exceeds the ability of the mind to control it. On the other hand, if mind concentrates only on speculative ideas and without undertaking any discipline, any ascetic practices on the spiritual level, if you just go on reading books, writing books, and then we may delude ourselves into thinking that we have really experienced what we are reading. That is some kind of a deception. You read a book on samadhi, and then you think you have reached that samadhi. It is only an idea. It's a grand example. So it happened both ways. So there should be a proper balance between physical and mental tapa. So the classical definition of tapa is manasascha indriyanam cha kaikagram paramam tapa. I mean, this concentration of mind and intellect and the senses on one point, that is tapa. So it is this tapa that actually enables us to sharpen our mind. And it is a spiritual practice that gives us the ability to see deeper into anything. Either if you are a scientist, you have to practice asceticism. If a person becomes extremely obsessed with luxuries and luxurious food, that person may not be able to become a great scientist, in the sense you cannot become a great investigator into truth, because science also is an investigation into higher truths. Nature reveals its secrets in direct proportion to the intense effort, the intensity of our effort. Well, yeah, in modern times, the paradigm has shifted. When you have put everything in a computer or some kind of a electronic gadget, then you need not retain things on your head. So you can get something and put everything in a tiny instrument, and then you can depend upon that instrument to recollect what you have studied earlier. So maybe the idea of tapas may have undergone some kind of a change as the paradigm has shifted. But compare a modern scientist working with all the ultra modern electronic gadgets. You compare such a person with somebody like Ptolemy, or let's say even Newton, who is not a very is close to our own times, maybe just about 300 years. So just think of that. The intensity of mental effort, the sharpness of the mind, the ability to focus on one idea, which gives us an insight to higher things. This is true in philosophy also, of course. In philosophy, art, anything, where all the forces of mind and the senses are focused on one point, then mind becomes a very wonderful, sublime instrument, and it can pierce through anything. So that gives us the power, the ability to understand things, to see deeper into things. So that is called tapa, ascetic practices. Vyasa and a commentator who wrote this Yoga Bhashya Vartigam on Vyasa Bhashya, on Patanjali Yoga Sutras. His name was Vijnana Bhikshu. There are two Vijnana Bhikshus you read about in Indian philosophical tradition. One was an earlier Vijnana Bhikshu, the same name. He was a Buddhist. The Vijnana Bhikshu who we are talking about was, of course, was a traditional author of Shindu, and he was a great devotee. So when I shall explain his own interpretation of Ishvara Pranidhana, he talks about Prabhati, self-surrendered, God's will. He talks about the highest karma yoga. He talks about bhakti and all. So that you find in the Vijnana Bhikshu's Yoga Bhashya Vartika. So this is the first aspect of Kriya Yoga. That's important to remember. So Kriya Yoga is a very elaborate, very scientific, and very very technical term used in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra. In plain English, in the simplest possible language, we can say, if you are working in an office, if you are a farmer, or a scientist, or a doctor, an engineer in modern times in the 21st century, you can enter the path of yoga. And that entrance is called Kriya Yoga for anyone. Or even if you are a saint sitting under a tree in the forest, then also Kriya Yoga. Because Kriya Yoga involves Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, selfless activity, and also the art of transforming our physical energy into spiritual energy. This may sound a bit abstract. For example, suppose a person has plenty of physical energy, very dynamic, very active by nature and by temperament. Now, that person can divert his natural tendency to be active, whatever he does. He can turn that field of activity into something sublime by infusing the element of uh, unselfishness and dedication and a sense of sanctity and sacredness into whatever he does. Then you are practicing Kriya Yoga. So you need not go to a temple or a church and pray and prostrate and surrender to God. No, nothing of the kind. That's very interesting. Of course, that is also mentioned here. Ishvara Pranidhanam is actually is defined by Vijnana Bhikshu as surrender to God, complete resignation to God. His language almost closely resembles the language of the bhakti, the devotional philosophers of India, like Vallabha, Nimbarka, Chaitanya, and others, which I am going to discuss when we discuss Ishvara Pranidhana. So this is Kriya Yoga. So how scientific and how psychologically very rational. Anyone can enter the path of yoga by practicing this Kriya Yoga. And of course, the simplest explanation is Swadhyaya Pranavadi Pavitranam Japa Moksha Shastram Adhyayanam. Swadhyaya means reading scriptures, reciting some sacred symbols. It can be done by anyone. Kriya Yoga in its Karma Yoga aspect can be practiced by anyone. Swadhyaya as a spiritual devotional practice can be done by any person belonging to any religious tradition. So there he says, of course, in the classical atmosphere of India's spiritual tradition, you find is mentioned, Pranavadi Pavitranam Japaha means when we chant Pranava, I mean Om, the Omkara. This is so it is considered to be Swadhyaya itself. Or reading books, Moksha Shastra, Adhyayanam, that's me. Adhyayana means study, self-study. Or maybe study under anybody else also. So Moksha Shastram here means any book or any branch of learning that talks about higher life, that eventually opens the door to our higher spiritual evolution. That is Moksha Shastra. It could be Bible for Christians, all the mystical works. It could be Vedas, Bhagavad Gita, and so on for the Hindus. It could be the Torah, Talmud of the religious texts of the Jews for the Jewish tradition. It could be, these Buddhists practice this. They have this prayer wheel. They chant sacred word symbols. That could be called Swadhyaya. Or even if you if you chant some psalms, it could be Swadhyaya. Because these practices, what happens, these practices will have an impact on our mind. And as we do more and more these practices, more and more new spiritual energy, spiritual energies, manifestations of energy are created in the mental system. And that will have an effect in our life. And mind begins to change and evolve. How do we feel this change happening in the mind? The first sign that mind is changing is we feel a kind of tranquility, and again we feel less disturbance and less inner conflict when we try to practice spiritual disciplines. If you go and sit somewhere to think of higher things in a calm, quiet atmosphere, if your mind is still very violent, very turbulent, That means your mind is not ready to agree with you when you meditate. You want to meditate, your mind doesn't want you to meditate. So mind becomes a stumbling block. So that's because of the negative samskaras, what we call negativity in modern, you can call it in some psychology, school psychology. Remember, so what happens, it's no use telling, well, let us be positive, let us do everything. That kind of self-imposed thing, mind, it doesn't have any lasting effect. There's a trend in modern times. Let us think of everything wonderful. That way, nothing becomes really wonderful. Because what our mind is, not just what we do now, it also consists of tendencies and impressions which are deposited in the mental system, not in this life, but in previous life cycles. That's why we feel the conflict. So this is a very important point to remember. That's why Swadhyaya is mentioned. Why now the question arises, why can't we read some novels or stories, thrillers, or anything? Why the commentator, Vyasa, he insists on this Moksha Shastra. Moksha Shastra means any holy book, holy in the sense that it gives you peace of mind and tranquility and a sense of sanctity and sacredness and meaningfulness and inner relevance of life. That's Moksha Shastra. Now, only when we think of something higher, some kind of higher life, higher than life at the sensory level, then only we'll be able to control the senses. See, we should be able to focus on something higher than the senses. Then only we'll be able to restrain the senses. To be able to restrain our senses, we should be able to focus on something that is higher than the senses. And Moksha Shastras, any religious tradition, these Moksha Shastras are available in all traditions. And also even in agnostic traditions, these are available. Of course, in the conventional sense, Buddhism is an agnostic religion. It doesn't affirm the existence of a creator God. Thank God in many ways. But the point is that Buddhism is so rich in these higher books. If you get, you may read Dhammapada, you may read any of these Vinaya Pidaga, Sutta Pidaga, Abhidhamma Pidaga, any of these Buddha's teaching, Buddha's parable, Jataka tales, all constitute some interesting examples of this higher reading that can serve the purpose of Swadhyaya. That is the second aspect. There is an interesting verse, how to select the right kind of book for reading. So this is sloka. Anantaparam kirad shabda shastram swalpam tadayu bhagavascha vignaha yat sarabhudam tad upasidavyam hamso yatha kshiramivam misram. It's a very interesting verse in ancient. It is also quoted by some yoga philosophers in their commentaries. Anandapara means the number of books is so mind-folding. So many titles, so many books, it's a huge forest. Now, and sometimes it's very difficult to select the right kind of books. And our lifespan is limited. I mean, our lifespan is limited. And also there are many obstacles. Bhagavascha Vigna means there are so many obstacles. Procrastinations, postponement, our own laziness. We already discussed this, now 9 antarayas. Illness, negativity, self-doubt, feeling of not moving, not making any progress, getting stuck somewhere, delusions, hallucinations. Sometimes without making any progress, we may delude ourselves into thinking that we have made a great progress. Sometimes even after making a lot of progress, we may still become skeptical. These are some of the problems that people may have to encounter when they take spiritual life. So these are all problems. So how to select the right kind of book? So that's why I mentioned earlier, any book, any work that gives us a kind of inner tranquility, peace, and contentment. It's called Kritakrityada and Kritarthada, inner contentment. So the poet uses a metaphor, a swan. It is believed in mythology. I don't know how far this is true physically, in the physical sense. A swan will be, if you mix water and milk and put in a pot, the swan will be able to drink milk and avoid drinking water. It has a filtering mechanism in its body. God knows, I don't know, that it can filter out water and drink milk alone. It can avoid milk and drink, sorry, it can avoid water and drink milk alone. It can select milk and drink and avoid drinking water. If you put a bowl full of uh, water and milk mixed together, a mixture of water and milk, if you place in front of a swan, this bird, the bird can uh, exclude water and drink milk alone. Like that, we should be able to select the right kind of book. I mean, any kind of book that creates conflicts, memories are to be avoided. I mean, there are books which can disturb our meditation, disturb even normal life by um, by projecting, false or negative, unpleasant images and impressions. Such sources of ideas should be avoided. That's the idea behind. So Vyasa, the great Vyasa, the commentator, he makes some very interesting observation in his commentary. So very interesting. I'm making special effort to bringing the words of the original commentators uh, with the one important purpose. First of all, when we many of the translations which don't always do full justice the original teachings of yoga, this aspect is totally neglected. So yoga is often presented as some kind of a uh, God negating, atheistic at worst, agnostic at the best way of life and philosophy of life. But the commentators give a totally different picture. So Vyasa, for example, says, na tapasvino yoga siddhyati anadi karma klesha vasana chitra pratyubasthita vishayajala cham ashud nirantarena tapa sambhedamapadyati iti tapasa upadanam. So this is Vyasa's own words. Now Vyasa says, Anadi karma klesha vasana chitra prati upasthita vishayajala cha shuddhi. So our mind is full of all kinds of thought currents, ideas and feelings and emotions and so on. I give this example. We can detect this. When we try to do something good, something noble, something not very practical in the sense, normally we will be able to do anything which brings an immediate practical visible results. That's very easy to do. You do something, you can see an immediate practical benefit. Easy to do. But very difficult to do something which we are not sure will produce an immediate beneficial result. Mind doesn't always feel very enthusiastic about it. Mind, as I mentioned, it doesn't always cooperate. It becomes hostile. The moment we try think of doing something noble, something good, you can easily understand. You will tomorrow. You try to meditate. One day you may feel, but if you try to make it a habit, immediately conflicting thoughts will come. Where do they come from? Why we cannot always do what we want to do? This is everyone's experience. If you could always do what we want to do, there'll be very few problems in the world. Every student wants to work hard, and he knows that he has to work hard to get good results. But he's not able to do, in spite of his best desire, intention. That's because, well, you have examination, you have something else to do, but in front of us there are, well, if you sit in a room, let us say with number of magazines, pictures, books, and many things, in which direction does our mind naturally flow? Nobody is observing. We are completely within our own jurisdiction. Nobody is controlling, nobody is supervising us. We know nobody is observing. What do we do? What we select for reading? What we do? That will indicate our true culture, true samskaras, means impressions. And frequently for many people, mind doesn't cooperate when they want to do something noble, when they want to meditate, when they want to read something sublime. Mind creates a hindrance. So Vyasa says, Anadi karma klesha vasana chitra means all days karmas, the previous life cycles that we have done karmas, actions, they produce the vasanas and they are mixed. And Vishayajala, they are all moving around with their own obsession for sensory objects. So they create these stumbling blocks. Cha ashuddhi means it is, of course, in the old language, impurity it is called. In modern psychology, you don't use the word impurity. Use the word more high-sounding word so that we can pat on our own back. We should negativity, we may say, if you want it. That's fine. But Vyasa being an old saint, uses a who lived for 4,000 years ago, uses the word ashuddhi, means impurity. And if a mind doesn't agree with what you are doing, if mind turns hostile when you try to do something noble, then it's because there is this impurity in some of the samskaras. So, na antarena tapa sambhedam apadyate. Without tapa, without some kind of austerity, you cannot get rid of this impurity. That's one advantage of austerity. See, for example, a greedy man wants to get away from greed. If he takes to charitable activities, you find a complete transformation. People who have amassed huge amounts of wealth during the early years, many great captains of industry, when they get old, suddenly they feel like doing something good for others, good for the rest of the world, and they start trust and foundations. Why they do that? By doing this, they are getting rid of this ashuddhi, this mental, the impurities of samskaras. That's why Vyasa says, Vishayajala ashuddhi. These impurities they are getting rid of. And when mental impurities are gone to that extent, we feel, oh, I have done something fine. I've done something sublime. And you feel a kind of inner tranquility and peace. So that's why Vyasa says, without ascetic practices, tapa, it is impossible to get rid of impurities of mind. That's why I mentioned earlier, tacha chitta prasadanam abadhamanam anena asevyam. But again, it's important, one should not overemphasize extreme ascetic practices because that may suddenly change the balance of mind. The purpose of ascetic practices is to transcend the physical, not to fight against the physical. We should not fight with ourselves. We should be able to transcend the physical. We should not fight with the physical. We should not antagonize the physical, but we should be able to get beyond the physical. That's the idea behind it. But the greatest enemy of this Kriya Yoga, especially Taba, is our extreme ideal of this pragmatism, raw pragmatism. See, because the moment you take the yoga, if you keep asking yourself the question, what way I'm going to be benefited by this? Well, one should be able to avoid these questions. One should be able to go beyond these questions in order to practice yoga. So that's why in one context, of course, Vijnana Bhikshu says, Arurukshor Mune Yogam Karma Karanam Uchyade Yoga Rudasyata Seva Shamak Karanam Uchyade. Actually, this is from Bhagavad Gita. This sloka from Bhagavad Gita is quoted by Vijnana Bhikshu when he wrote this super commentary on Vyasa's commentary on Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Vijnana Bhikshu quotes from Bhagavad Gita and also Bhagavata Purana. And you find many of his ideas closely resemble the teachings of the devotional philosophers of India like Narada, Shandilya, Ramanuja, Nimbarka, Vallabha, Chaitanya, and so on. So that's what he says, Those who are desirous of practicing yoga, for them, those who are beginning, that is, those who are about to practice Kriya Yoga, they should act. How they should act? Without any selfish motive and without any attachment, mentally offering the fruits of their labor, the results of their work to God. But those who already attained some stage in yoga practices, for them, they can practice self-restraint, but a beginner should practice karma yoga. And also when we, tapas swadhyaya ishara pranidhana. While talking about ishara pranidhana, that is self-surrender to God. Vijnana Bhikshu says, Yat karoshi, yat asnasi, yat jigoshi, dadasi, yat tapasyasi kauddeya, tat kurusha madarpanam. This is also from Bhagavad Gita. It is the thesis of self-surrender. Whatever I do, even whatever I eat, whatever rituals I practice, yajna, etc. When I do charity, when I do meditation, mentally do all this, offering the action and also the result to God. It's called prapatti, sharanagati. And he, karodi yadis sagalam parasmai narayana samarpayami. That also he says, this you find in some different versions, you find Bhagavad Gita and also Bhagavata Purana. Whatever we do, everything in the name of God. Karma phalanam isharo bhokta idi chintanam karma phala sannyasa. There's no definition of Ishwar Pranidhana by Vijnana Bhikshu. I'm quoting it because some days back while reading while discussing yoga, maybe in the 2 sessions earlier, in the second or third session, somebody raised this question about Ishvara in yoga. So I try to explain this. Ishvara has a place in yoga, but yoga's earlier philosophical legacy goes to Sankhya philosophy. Sankhya has got 2 aspects. One is Sweshara Sankhya philosophy of later times, which accepts God, and the earlier version of Sankhya, which doesn't accept a creator God. That's the idea behind. So These three disciplines constitute the entrance, the door to spiritual life. When we are talking about Kriya Yoga as such, we are not talking about yoga alone. These three disciplines, ascetic practices, Swadhyaya, and of course, self-surrender, surrender to God. These three disciplines, they constitute what we call Kriya Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, all are included here. If you have got anything more to ask, we can clarify during the question and answer session. Okay. Now, next sutra is next sutra is very, very, very important. Samadhi bhavanartha klesha tanukarnascha. So that is something. So to bring about samadhi, what we should do, we should do spiritual practices which weakened kleshas. Kleshas, I mentioned earlier, afflictions. Kleshas will be defined in the next sutra. So these sutras are interrelated sometimes. One sutra comes and then you understand the true implications of that sutra only in the succeeding sutra. So next one is this, that is Samadhi Bhavanartha. What is Samadhi? In order to bring about Samadhi and for the attenuation of for the weakening, the less afflictive, to weaken the kleshas, that is the purpose. We will take up this sutra after we discuss the third sutra. So you understand the meaning of the second sutra more clearly when you first learn the third sutra. The third sutra explains kleshas because the second sutra talks about bringing about samadhi for weakening of kleshas. And what are kleshas? Avidya, asmita, ragadesha, abhinivesha, klesha. This is the third sutra. What are kleshas? Avidya, ignorance. Asmita, egoity or individuality. And then attachment, raga, aversion, dvesha, clinging to life. These are the five kleshas. Now, what is clinging to life? That can be very confusing for those who don't go through the traditional commentaries. Clinging to life actually is, in actual practice, it expresses as some kind of an irrational fear of death. That's how clinging to life becomes one of the kleshas. Because if you don't get a clear implication of this sutra, people could misunderstand, clinging to life is some kind of a problem. It is something to be avoided, something to be got rid of. No. All fears, all concerns, especially all irrational fears, meaningless, totally meaningless concerns, anxieties, worries, which frequently affect our mind and disturb our mind without any justification. All these are indirectly linked to the idea that death is something unpleasant, scary, and fearful. One should prolong it as far as possible. One should strive to live for 100 years, 120 years. That's wonderful. But when the fear becomes a kind of an obsessive psychosis, that can create many kinds of peculiarities in the mental system. Many obsessions, phobias are all linked to this in a way. So that is technically called abhinivesha. So we shall try to explain one after another. So this is most difficult to understand. Why clinging to life, abhinivesha, is called a klesha, which is something that should be weakened according to the second sutra. What it means is we should not ever imagine that this physical body is the only thing to be cared for. Or we should not ever imagine that this physical identity is the only identity that we have got. The true I is far greater than my physical body. Once we realize this, then we can weaken this abhinivesha, this irrational fear, concern, and anxiety about death. For example, people who become extremely attached to his body or her body, let's say, the slightest physical problem creates extreme fear. This could happen. In fact, this is happening right now in today's world. This coronavirus it has a psychological dimension also. Irrational fears, irrational concerns, absolutely unjustified anxieties, and to consequent depression. It has become a problem. Not that we should neglect the problem. We should address the problem. We should do all that's possible for us, using all possible means at our disposal to address this problem and to keep ourselves healthy and strong and happy. No doubt about it. That's very important. But when it becomes an extreme obsession to the point of being anxious all the time about our health, then it actually will become a problem for the health. It will affect the health. So that kind of obsessive attachment is called abhinivesha. And the two other problems mentioned before, raga and dvesha, that also, raga means extreme attachment. That is also, when we get extremely attached to something in a very irrational way, it is raga. And when we become extremely averse to something, hostile to something, with a strong negative attitude to something, which is totally irrational, then it becomes dvesha. So remember, many of these things are common for everyone. Extreme concern for health is perfectly okay, very normal, and very healthy also. And you should have some liking for something higher, noble, wonderful. That is very important. That is very much necessary. The Yoga Sutra itself mentions that you should have attachment to a higher ideal, which is very important at the beginning of everyone's spiritual life. We should have some higher ideal, and we should identify ourselves with that higher ideal. And we should try to keep away from things that could become problematic. So dvesha, all these in the normal aspects is perfectly okay. They become problems, they become kleshas affecting our lives, creating totally irrational feelings and emotions. Then they become kleshas. Those kleshas become problematic. So that we will discuss in the next session. Now we can discuss the subject. If you have got questions, most welcome. Yeah.
Pranams Maharaj. This is Bobby. I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Very good. I know that many of the classical commentators focused on the characterization of the commitment to Ishvara. And I'm wondering for our context on an English approach to the word pranadana.
Isha
and
Pranidhana.
whether or not we're to orient ourselves to a commitment to Ishvara for the purposes of Kriya Yoga, or some of the commentators are translated as surrender. And does it matter? Does it depend on the background of the student, or in other words,
Right.
is it culturally specific, or is one definition perhaps better than the other?
Yeah, this is there is of course a problem, the problem of syntax and language and culture. They frequently become problematic. When you talk about surrendering to God in his Sanskrit equivalent in Indian tradition, it may not have exactly the same connotation or implication as we have when we use his English translation. So Pranidhanam here in the normal Sanskrit tradition means accepting God as one's great refuge. That's an aspect. The surrendering idea is mentally offering one's actions and the results to God. And that there is not a spiritual seeker becoming a slave and God becoming a master is totally alien to yoga Vedanta tradition. But that's not at all the implication. Translations can, of course, create that implication. That's because of some of similar ideas in some of the religions of Brahmic tradition. That problem is there. So immediately we will try to understand this idea in the context of what we are familiar with. Well, but when you read the writings of the medieval Christian mystics, you find did not feel miserable because they have surrendered to Jesus. If you read the autobiographical writings, rather they were always enjoying that. So that's something very interesting. That enjoyment, the feeling of we call Sanskrit ananda, the feeling of inner joy and enjoyment when you surrender your actions to God. There is there's not that kind of surrender as we understand in modern ordinary language. You give up everything and you become a pauper. Not at all. You become richer when you look upon God as your friend, as the refuge. That is the idea that you find in the mystical traditions of the Abrahamic heritage. So also in Hindu tradition. So of course that English translation can produce this effect. You got everything taken. So God is sitting somewhere in a throne, he's a big master and boss, and we are all sitting below on the ground at his not in that sense, that at all. So that's an idea behind Isha Pranidhana.
Thank you, Maharaj. I mean, I did not want to lead your response, but clearly what I was getting at was that at least for the last 200 years, the attraction, for example, of Max Muller and to the Brahmo Samaj was the idea that it was more a matter of commitment and a matter of
Yeah.
focused meditation
Yeah.
rather than slavish surrender. So in the
Yeah.
modern context, it seems like
Yeah.
your answer clarified that in the sense that I meant.
Thank you. Thank you for that point is very clear. Western intellectuals, highly enlightened Western intellectuals, philosophers, Indologists, mostly European Indologists, later some Indologists in America also, they took to Vedanta and the higher, especially Advaita Vedanta of India, because it is so sublime. It doesn't ask you to forfeit your own freedom and accept God as the boss. Yoga also doesn't do that. Yoga here, they recommends this as a means for those who are entering the path of yoga, who are uh, who are afflicted by many problems. So the moment you think God is your all, that takes a heavy burden off our shoulders. That's, remember, that is also one of the three aspects. There are people who need that sort of thing, not a Max Muller. A Max Muller or Paul Dewson can be happy with the highest sublime teachings of Vedanta. But there are many people all over the world you find who don't have the higher philosophical attitude, and they would rather live uh, as a this statement, as some kind of a spiritual slave than as an assertive spiritual seeker. So there are people like that. For them also, some kind of medicine is needed, and yoga gives a medicine to them. Well, if you take, if you surrender all your action, the results of God, then also you can feel the inner peace. Of course, as you proceed further, you go beyond that. It's a primary school kindergarten. Kriya Yoga constitutes the primary school. Is the entrance. And again, the Ishapanidhana is one of the three aspects. They together, these three together constitute Kriya Yoga. But there are people who enter Kriya Yoga through Karma Yoga alone. And there are those who enter Kriya Yoga through Jnana Yoga alone. And the Ishapanidhana, the Prabhati, self-surrender is the highest spiritual refuge for certain classes of people who may not be ready to wait, work, or practice karma yoga, or practice philosophical inquiry. For them, they want somebody else to take care of all their needs. And yoga actually presents an option for them also, not Vedanta. Remember, again, always remember, Yoga Sutra we are discussing not because that's the greatest message of Hindu tradition. I want to mention this. Yoga Sutra doesn't present the highest spiritual goal in front of us, but it presents a path that can take us to the highest spiritual goal. This is an important point. Ashtanga Yoga, the central theme of Yoga Sutra. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi. Samadhi is the last, the eighth. That Samadhi itself, it only makes you fit for eventually becoming highest jnani, getting the highest spiritual enlightenment. But that itself is not the highest spiritual enlightenment, according to Shankaracharya. So Shankaracharya says, if you practice all the Kriya Yoga, Tapas, Swadhyaya, that's how you enter. Then finally, when you reach Asampragnata Samadhi, you find the later towards the Kaivalya Pada and Samadhi Pada, you find highest Samadhi. That Samadhi itself will take you to a level, when your mind is totally free from all impurities. And when when it reaches that stage of purification and purity and tranquility, then that mind, if it listens to Vedanta, that mind quickly grasps it. But that itself is not the highest goal. That only makes you to eventually, not immediately, eventually reach the highest goal. So yoga helps you to reach the highest level of mental purity or chitta shuddhi. Once you reach there, then naturally a person will eventually reach the highest spiritual goal. This I remember. Yoga is important because it contains many important teachings that we can practice right now in this 21st century. In the midst of all, and also it reveals many aspects, the mysteries of human mind. That's the uniqueness of yoga. See, why I'm thinking the way I'm thinking, why I'm behaving the way I'm behaving. Can I change my own destiny? Can I change my own behavior pattern, the way I speak? Can I see a different world when the mind changes. So all these you find in yoga. Vedanta doesn't deal with all those details. Patanjali, to be more precise, Vyasa is the one whom we should thank for unraveling this great mystery of human mind. So Yoga Sutra only help you to understand the workings of our mind. But remember, it is not a kind of psychological analysis. It slowly takes you to a higher and higher and more sublime level of consciousness and awareness. That is the greatness of Yoga Sutra. Yoga is a dualistic philosophy. Remember, it is not Advaita. It's a dualistic philosophy. It is not wrong. It is right. But when you reach this highest goal, then you find you have to go slightly more. You travel a little longer distance. That's the greatness.
Swami, can I ask you a question?
Most welcome. Most welcome.
So when I'm talking to people who are near death, they are very afraid. Now it's easier when a person is Hinduist because we can tell them the Atma is eternal. So for the Christian, this thing, they believe that the soul will, go and join Christ in the end. But, the concept of soul is different than our concept of Atma. So I try to tell them that the body is the only thing that is, body is not going to last forever. But your Atma, of course, the soul, is something eternal. So try to, make them realize that they are not the body, but they are this inner strength. And so I try to bring in a little bit of our Hindu philosophy into that, but sometimes it's difficult when you deal with a person who's a Christian or a Muslim.
I think it may not help very much if you try to interpret death and the final destiny in Hindu terms when you're addressing the problem of Christian. The best thing you can do, you talk about Christ, his greatness. He was a great, he is the symbol of humanism, mercy, compassion, many of the great qualities that you find that are so much venerated and discussed in details in all the Hindu scriptures. You find in, say, Lord Krishna gives a list of what you call Devi Sampat, the divine or the spiritual qualities of a person. You find all that in Christ. So you talk about the great Hindu sages of Puranas and Hindu scriptures. You find all those qualities in Christ. No, you should ask them to pray to Christ, and you should. It's not very difficult. If there are many wonderful writings which depict the teachings of Jesus, and especially the personality of Jesus, his humanism and his compassion. And
I find the Sermon on the Mountain is very helpful.
So what you can do, you can ask them to pray to Christ. I don't think it's a good idea to talk Vedanta to an aged Christian who is about to die, who may not be familiar with this. If you tell him you are Atman, you are not this body, it may not mean anything to him. On the other hand, if you tell you are safe in the hands of Christ, will be compassionate towards you, pray to him, that will be fine. Immediately he will understand. This is very important point. We should not impose Vedanta on everybody's head. It may not be very wise thing to do, or even it may not be a proper thing to do. I would suggest that you talk to them about the teachings of some parables. You can talk to them. You can even take some parables and teachings from, let us say, St. John of Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. Many of the mystics, maybe Eckhart may not be the right subject for, because Eckhart is very philosophical and a bit Advaitic. So some of the classical devotional persons, the saints, Christian saints, that be the best thing for it. And pray to Christ. Prayer is something everyone can even listen to you. Instead of talking about you are not a body, you are not mind. I don't think that would be the right thing. Even for ordinary Hindus, who may be coming from non-Vedantic traditions. After how many, what percentage of Hindus are Vedantics? Not a huge percentage. Only those who are.
In my piece of fish, there are two there. One is yours. One
Thank you, Swamiji.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Swamiji, one question. I have a question. This is more like I would like your correction for me if I have misunderstood something.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to make a comment that Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras is not sectarian at all. There is no sectarian definition given in the Ishvara. The Ishvara is, we don't want to go through the number of sutras which talk about Ishvara, but it's very clear it is not sectarian. So any particular god of any religion can be made as the Ishvara of the Yoga Sutras. That's one number point. The second point I want to raise is, there are Ishvara Pranidhana Dva, or the option is given in the initial portion of the meditation. You can, why Ishvara Pranidhana or surrender to God also, it will lead you to some value and all those things. But at the end, he did not give an option when you say Samadhi Siddhihi Ishvara Pranidhanat. That is at the little bit later. So the success of the Samadhi or the attainment of perfection of Samadhi is by surrender to Ishvara. There, he did not give an option. Just wanted to make a note. Please comment if I have misunderstood anything.
Yeah. The Ishvara mentioned here doesn't actually correspond to the monotheistic Ishvara, of Vaishnava tradition, Shakta tradition, Saiva tradition. In Yoga Sutra, the Ishvara is a highly evolved person who is whose memory will help us in the right direction. So Yoga Sutra, the Ishvara as understood in Yoga Sutra could be interpreted as the same Ishvara mentioned in the Bhagavata Purana and Gita, according to some commentators, and Vajaspati is one of them. Vajaspati is quoting from Bhagavata Purana, is quoting from Bhagavad Gita, and Vyasa also quotes from some scriptures, not Bhagavad Gita, so that you find some commentators make it out that the Ishvara of Yoga Sutra roughly corresponds to the popular Ishvara concept of Hindu monotheistic traditions, Shaiva, Shakta, and so on. That's why Bhagavad Purana is Narayana Idi Samarpayi Tat Karoli Sarvam Sagalam Parasmai Narayanaya Iti Samarpayi. That is Vyajaspati. He quotes Bhagavad Purana. So the point is, when we talk about Patanjali's Sutra as such, it's difficult to say Patanjali actually meant the Saguna Sakara Sadvisesha Ishvara when he used the word Ishvara. That Ishvara can be any highly evolved spiritual concept acceptable to any person, in any religious tradition. The question arises, when you talk about surrender, somebody from a non-Hindu tradition, from somebody from a Brahmanic tradition, will immediately detect this problem, surrender, because it is so much emphasized, not in Christianity so much, except in mysticism, not even Judaism, but in some other traditions. I don't want to mention that there are controversies on this subject, because surrendering to God, the devotee is one who has surrendered. That idea is not easily acceptable to many well-educated, cultured, intellectual people in the West. That's why the problem arises. So we are addressing the problem from that angle. If we address the problem within the limits of Hindu tradition, then it would be okay to say that Patanjali meant by Ishvara the same concept of Ishvara as expounded in the Bhagavad Gita. The Vajaspati is an example, and also, Vijnana Bhikshu is an example. Vajaspati also similar statements are there. Shankaracharya Vivarana also, he also accepts Ishvara as such. But what Patanjali meant That is a different thing. So what Patanjali actually meant, we can only understand from the commentaries. Patanjali is very brief. So it is both views have a justification in Yoga Sutra tradition. The justification that it is Vaishnava God, or God as understood by Vaishnavas, applicable to everyone, not only for Vaishnavas, or God in a universal sense, somebody who is a highly evolved person, not necessarily a monotheistic God. Patanjali doesn't appear to have faith or accepted a monotheistic creator God as a Saguna, Kalyana, Guna, Nidhi, Ramana, that kind of idea. Patanjali didn't accept it. But you can commentators put it that way. Both views are right. The problem arises here. Remember, you should know the background. That problem is surrender to God is not a very pleasant idea for many modern intellectuals. That's where the discussion, and that discussion is a valid point, because it is not acceptable. That's because God has got not a very good reputation in modern times. That's a different subject. Discuss that.
Swamiji, just a small comment.
No, let us another question. We should not one. Can again we get anybody else?
Maharaj, question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the two things about surrendering to God, or not clinging to life, overcoming death, or even meditation. These take different levels of even understanding of that. Even surrendering to God, there are different level as you listen to lectures and come. So my question is, what is a good path to get rid of the kleshas? What do you say? Like, is it fasting, chanting? Sometimes even if you do volunteering or selfless work, even then it's very hard to get to that state of surrendering to God. So is there Vyasa or anybody suggest some of the preliminary steps or the good path to...
The Prapatti idea, Sharanagati idea is more popular in Vaishnava tradition. It has got a great psychological significance, because if you sincerely can believe that God is the one who is behind everything, God is only, He is the Karta and Bhokta, that's all Jnana Bhikshu says in Yoga Bhashya Vartika. In that, if you can sincerely believe that, you can feel a lot of load, heavy burden is lifted off your shoulders. You can feel that way. That could happen. Yeah, that could happen. If sincerely one can do that, one can believe God is everything. Then the point is, we accept it's a great idea, but when we try to practice, we feel conflict. That's because that surrender has not taken place in reality. That if it could happen in reality, there'll be no problem. That's a thing. If a person can sincerely believe God is behind everything, then he won't feel any conflict, any pain or any setback. He won't have any anxiety, because he has strong belief that God is behind everything. But we accept it and we do that, but the real mental surrender may not be actually psychologically complete. When it is not complete, then the conflict continues. When it is complete, we must go for complete. Yeah. The Ishwar Pranidhana is mentioned at the beginning, and Kriya Yoga is the first step towards yoga. Anyone can do that, and it's a great help. Karma Yoga is a great help. Bhakti is a great help. So also Kriya Yoga is a great help. Ishwar Pranidhana is a great help. So that's why it's mentioned as a beginning, as an entrance into yoga life.
Thank you, Maharaj. Next question from Saugata and then Jatin. I see two hands in the order.
Hello, Swami. Pranam, Swamiji. I have a question. I mean, this is a technical, simple question. So this raga, the raga, it is, if you take the raga, so we can say that attachment to life is also a raga, but attachment to life is same as fear of death. So why does Patanjali separately specify fear of death, because it comes into raga itself.
Yeah. Clinging to life was considered to be a problem by Buddhists also. That is also one of the reasons why Trishna and clinging to life causes this praditi samudpada, the continued life cycles, one after another, birth, death, and rebirth, and so on. So, most probably it has something to do with the contemporary times of Patanjali. The idea of clinging to life, some fear. Again, clinging to life is to be understood as fear of death.
Yes.
Clinging to life as such is not considered to be a klesha, but clinging to life interpreted as fear of death becomes a klesha. That's the idea. So again, as I mentioned earlier, when it becomes some kind of an obsession, creating unnecessary irrational fears and anxieties without any justification, then only it is called abhinivesha. See, all these aspects, avidya, asmida, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. Asmida means egoity. Without self-confidence, you cannot take to yoga. So it's one aspect of ego. But the same thing can become a problem when it's touched to another level. So there it becomes asmida. So it's called a klesha, to be got rid of. That's the thing. Again, raga, you need a higher ideal. You need to, even without some interest in yoga life or scriptures or higher life, you won't take the trouble to study Yoga Sutra, practice yoga. You won't do that. But at the same time, when we become obsessively attached to sensory objects or things like that, then it becomes a klesha, not in normal life. If you have an interest in something, you have to do that. But if that becomes an obsessive problem to the point of disturbing your normal life, then becomes a klesha. So also dvesha. You may not like everything or everyone, but you cannot. There are many things that you would rather not do. It should not be interpreted as a dvesha, as a klesha. But aversion towards things can itself becomes a psychological burden, some kind of an obsession. It becomes a klesha. The kleshas register strongly in our mental system. It's called karmasya, the repository where all the klesha samskaras are deposited. It becomes a problem. And these klesha samskaras will take fruit only in the next life, not necessarily in this life. So all these have a normal human aspect, and also uh, another aspect when it becomes a klesha. That is what should be avoided. Tapa is mentioned here. Tapa is mentioned here. Vyasa says tapa should not be some kind of over asceticism to the point of disturbing the mind and body. Then it becomes a hindrance yoga. But without tapa, you cannot enter yoga. Same tapa, when it becomes excessive over asceticism, torturing the body, your mind, then becomes a problem.
Can somebody say that all the other kleshas are part of avidya?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, actually, avidya is the mother of all kleshas. That's why avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. Avidya means error or ignorance. Normally, what it means is, technically, in the yoga philosophical tradition, which is again linked with Sankhya, we forget our Purusha identity and we identify ourselves with the Prakriti, the Jada Prakriti and its evolution. That is the philosophical explanation. That process, that phenomenon is called ignorance. So we identify ourselves with every passing experience, all that we see around us. That's all.
Thank you, Swami.
I want to remind everyone, yoga is essentially a dualistic system, and yoga is important. Yoga sutras are so important. Yoga shastras, it's very important because it analyzes the human mind, describes the vrittis and vasanas and samskaras, and all these are fully accepted and accepted as the right understanding in Advaita Vedanta. All Indian systems of theistic system of Indian philosophy recognize yoga, analysis of human mind, vritti, samskaras, vasana, all fully accepted. Only yoga conclusion, Purusha and Prakriti are two eternal categories. Then Purusha is Sachetana and Prakriti is Jata, and the entire creative phenomenal world is nothing but evolutes, 23 evolutes of Prakriti, Mahatattva, Ahangara, then Sattva Ahangara, Tamasiga, Rajasya Ahangara, then Tanmatras, and then Panchamahabhutas, and we identify ourselves with all these. So that permanent distinction between Purusha and Prakriti as two separate entities, which again is a legacy of Sankhya philosophical tradition. So yoga and Sankhya are basically dualistic systems. Dualism doesn't mean two, it means more than one. That is the real meaning of dualism. Shankaracharya himself used the word, the word, Siddhanta Vyavasthasu Dvaitino Nischita Dudam. There Dvaitini means in Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaishashya. Yeah.
Just a small comment.
Please. Thank you, Dan. Please.
See, this is actually refers to the older question of Ishvara, which was brought earlier.
Yeah.
See, even though the term Narayana was used by a commentator on the Yoga Sutras, really the Yoga Sutras does not mention the term Narayana at all.
Yeah.
In fact, the definition of Ishvara for the Yoga Sutra author is only that he should not be stuck like other people in the samsara. And Sapurve Shamampi Guruhu, that means he is a teacher of the older teachers also.
Yeah.
Maybe only one problem there is Tasya Vachaka Pranavaha. That means Pranava is indicative of that particular Ishvara, which is sort of questionable because that make it sectarian. Does it make it sectarian there?
It doesn't make sectarian. It doesn't make sectarian at all. Doesn't make. When we study Yoga Sutra right now, the one problem is, Patanjali's sutras themselves may not make much sense without Vyasa's commentary. If you look at the chronology of the commentators, can you think of Patanjali without Vyasa, without Sakshari commentators? See, even the very concept of samskara, which actually, really speaking, it is a unique contribution to modern psychology, unique contribution of yoga psychology. The way samskaras and vasanas or sankalpas interpreted in the yoga system, you won't find that anywhere in modern psychology. What I mean to say, but it's all Vyasa's work. Even the analysis of human mind, Kshiptam, Modam, Vikshiptam, Ayagakra, Vyasa's work. Patanjali never mentions that. So, this is one view. There was a succession of teachers and students, beginning with Vyasa, and in that line you have got these commentators like Vijnana Bhikshu, who was a devotee, and according to some authors, it's very debatable. He was a follower of Nimbarka and Vallabha. There is one view, we don't know. So you can find him emphasizing this Prabhati, Saranagati ideal of Gita and Bhagavata are quoted to emphasize the Ishvara ideal of Yoga Sutra. Patanjali probably never dreamt of that. So you can find a long departure from Patanjali's original teachings. Anyway, that is, we need not worry. But these commentators have enriched yoga literature, giving more meaning and relevance and extending the dimensions of yoga system, which Patanjali may not have even dreamt of. Mostly the succeeding teachers and students who came in that line of Vyasa have enriched. That's all. Again, so you can find different interpretations. Rajamata and Bhoja gives different interpretations. He was also devotee. Shankara was, he gives an Advaitic twist to certain aspects. So anyway, that takes us to different level. So thank you for all the participation. Most welcome. Thank you. Namaskar. Will you conclude? Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.